So in this tutorial I'll be showing you how to create this freezing or this frost effect, and we're going to be using dynamic paint to control where hair particles appear. We're also going to be using dynamic paint as a mask for some textures, and then we'll do a small bit of compositing at the end to remove a small amount of noise and a bit of colour correction. The first thing we're going to do is add a plane. So I've got my text object and I'm just going to go into top view and add a mesh plane, and this effect is basically created by having dynamic paint go across the scene, and that's how we control everything. And so I'm just going to create a plane, and this is going to act as our ground which the dynamic paint can travel along. So I'm just going to scale it up a bit, and I've got a camera and I'm just going to make sure that it's in view properly, and then I'm just going to move this end in a bit because I don't want it to be overly long. So we can see it's starting outside of the camera view, which is what we want. What I'm then going to do is join the objects together, and to do that this text object here has to be converted to a mesh. So it's at the resolution that I want, so I'm going to press Alt-C and then Mesh from Curve, and I'm going to go into Edit mode, and I'm going to remove the back of the mesh, and that's basically because I found that removing it helps the dynamic paint work a bit better. I'm just going to deselect everything apart from one face, and then press L, and that will select everything connected to that face, and then I'm going to go over here and press L again. And this basically works because when a text object is converted to a mesh, it doesn't merge together the vertices which make the front and the back and the middle. So we've got these selected, and I'm going to press delete, and we're going to delete the faces. The next thing we're going to do is, if I just select these front parts, you can see that they're separate. We want them to be connected, so I'm going to select everything, press W, and then remove doubles. And you can see 93 removed, and pressing L again, we can see everything is connected properly. And what I'm then going to do is merge these two meshes together. So I'm going to select them both with Shift and then Control J, and you can see that the shading's gone a bit odd because we're using smooth shading, but it's getting a bit odd at the corners. So I'm just going to add an edge limit modifier and then just turn this up a bit so it smooths most of it. And basically this is going to be our canvas which the dynamic paint is going to draw onto. So now we need to create our brush. So I'm just going to place the 3D cursor over here and add a mesh UV sphere. And what we want is just the edge of the sphere to be intersecting with this plane. And what I'm going to do is go to frame 10 and then I location, and that's set a keyframe for the animation, and then I've gone back to frame 1 and we're going to move it below the red line, which is where the plane is, and press I location. And if we scroll between there, we can see it animates up. And what this is doing is, this is going to be our brush. So what we're saying is, we want it to rise up, and as it rises up, it will start drawing on the plane, and then effectively the dynamic paint will travel along the plane and over the text. So the next thing to do is to turn this into a dynamic paint brush. So over on the physics panel, dynamic paint, it's our brush, we're going to add a brush, and all we're going to do is change it to black, and then over on what's going to be our canvas, we're going to click dynamic paint, add canvas, and I'm going to call this dynamic spread because the ink is going to be spreading along using the spread effect. It's going to be an image sequence. I'm going to set this to be a resolution of 128 for the tutorial, but you should set this higher when you do yours. It's going to run for 240 frames. We're not going to use the advanced effects, we're going to turn off drying, and the next thing we need to do is UV unwrap our object because we need to use a UV map to paint the dynamic paint on. So before I do that, I'm going to press Ctrl A and we're going to apply the rotation and scale, and that just gives slightly more accurate UVs. We're then going to tab into edit mode and I'm going to bring out a UV panel. So the first thing I'm going to do is select everything and open up an image that is going to determine what colour everything is, and we're just going to use this to line everything up by, and later on it's going to give the colour to everything. So I'm going to select our plane, go into top view and project from view, and I'm just going to scale it down and just move it into that top part because the plane is going to be grey and the text is going to be yellow. I'll then press Ctrl-I to invert the selection. And for this part, we're actually going to go into the camera view and project it from the camera. And then project from view. You can see it squashed it a bit. So we're just going to scale it out a bit with S and X until roughly we get the right proportions. And then we're just going to move it down into the yellow part. And we can close this down now because we now have a UV map we can use for the dynamic paint. We're then going to choose a folder, and it has already created one, but I want to name it a bit better. So this is going to be dynamic spread. We're going to accept that, and then we're going to change the name to be spread, and then using the hash symbol to represent the frames, and then .png. And we're then going to set an initial color of white, and the dynamic paint effect we're going to use is spread, and the spread is going to be set to 2.5. And so what I'm going to do now is bake out this image sequence just by pressing bake, and then I'll come back when that's done. So that's finished now, and it's rendered all these images into this folder. And what I'm going to do now is set up a temporary texture just so we can see the effects in the viewport. So I'm going to do a new material. I'm just going to do this quickly because it's just to show this texture off. I'm then going to open an image, and we're going to open it. We're then going to set it to be an image sequence. We've got 240 frames in our image sequence, and we want it to automatically refresh. And if I then go to textured, we can see that image we loaded in before in the UV image editor. So I'll tab into edit mode, bring out the UV image editor, select everything. I'm going to remove this image, and then from the drop down I'm going to choose this spread image, and this spread image is the image we just loaded in. So if I choose spread, and don't worry by the fact that it's gone pink, I'm going to tab out of edit mode, back to the beginning, and as I scroll through you can now see the dynamic paint. Now there is one problem with it, and that's the fact it's only affecting this bottom plane and isn't actually affecting this 3D text. And to fix that, we're going to animate this sphere again. So we're going to see the point when the text should start going dark, and that's when this line meets the base of the text. So it's around frame 83. So I'm going to go into solid mode with the sphere selected. I'm going to press I, then location, and then on the next frame I'm just going to move it so it's slightly touching the text, and then I, location. So what's happening is the sphere is affecting this part, it's going to come up and affect that, and then at the point when this ink is coming up and is meant to touch the 3, it's then going to appear there, and it should start drawing properly. So again, I'm going to bake out our images. But one thing I'm going to do is actually swap the colours we're using. So I'm going to set the canvas to be black and the brush to be white, and then I'm going to rebake. So now that's finished, I'm going to go over to the texture panel and just refresh, and you can see the texture's updated, and then back into textured mode. Press back, and then as I scroll through you can see that it's now working correctly. And you can see as we get to the end, the text is fully covered. Now that's the whole of the dynamic paint dealt with, and the next thing we're going to do is create the crystals that are going to act as our ice or frost crystals. So I'm just going to add a cube, tab into edit mode, and then press G, Y, and then 1, and basically I just want the origin point to be at the bottom of the mesh, and then S and then Shift Y, just to scale it down, and pressing Shift Y means it will scale on every axis apart from Y. And then I'm just going to extrude this out, scale it down, and we're just going to create a few random crystal shapes. So we've got a few random crystals here, and I'm going to select them all and then press Ctrl G to group them, and then I'm just going to move them away from the area a bit and scale them down, and then press Ctrl A and again apply their rotation and scale. And so the next thing we're going to do is create our particle system, or our hair system. So over in the particle tab, we're going to click New. We're going to change it to be Hair and Advanced. We'll then change it to be a random distribution. Change the normal to something really low, and the normal in hair's case affects the length of the hair. So 0.004, and now we can't see it, but that's fine for the minute. The random can be 0.05, so it's giving a bit of random length. We'll give it a random size, and then we are going to render a group. So we'll choose that group we just made, and we'll say pick random, so it picks each of them randomly. And we're then going to turn on some interpolated children. And this basically creates more particles for every single particle. So at the minute, it's going to render 100 particles for every one particle we have set up at the top. You can see it's going a bit slowly because there's a lot of particles. So I'm actually going to set that down to something really low at the minute to make it a bit quicker. So for every one of these particles, it's going to create 100 more. And actually, I think 100 is a bit too much, so I'll change it to 50. And then all we're going to change is this random value, which gives random roughness to the children. And I'm just going to set that to 1. And then what I'm going to do is give this a temporary material just so we can see what's going on. So I'm going to change that to red, and then selecting the others with Shift and then selecting this last, I'm going to press Ctrl L, and we're going to link the materials together so they're now all using the same material. We can just see them here, but they're a bit small. So I'm just going to change their size to be about 0.1, and we'll maybe increase it to about 200. And under the children, I'm actually going to display only 1, but that means I can put this number up a bit, and we're actually going to use a number of 5,000, which is quite high. You can see things slow down a bit. And so we'll just set up some world settings quickly, just so we can give this a quick render. So just change the world to a lighter grey and turn on environment lighting. And then I'll set this to be maybe 40%, and I'll render that. And you will find that with the particles, it takes a long time before you actually see the render, and that's because what it's basically doing is converting all these single particles into real geometry, and so that takes quite a long time. And so you can see here that although it doesn't look like much on the screen, because we've got a lot of child particles rendering, it looks like a lot when we render. And one thing we need to change is just selecting this sphere. I'm going to press Ctrl H, and that means it won't appear in the render. So the next thing we're going to do is use the dynamic paint images which we created, and we're going to use that to limit where the particles appear. So over in the texture tab, selecting our object with the particle system, we now have a particle texture tab. So I'm going to click New, change it to Image or Movie, click Open. I'm going to choose the first image in our image sequence, and we have 240 frames. We want to auto refresh, and we want to use UV mapping, but instead of affecting the time, I think that is, we're going to affect the length of the particle, and you can already see some of them disappeared. And if I go back to the beginning of the animation and scroll through, you can see that our particles are appearing where our dynamic paint is appearing. But the problem with this is that we have these particles going to the edge, and later on we're going to create a bit of a background, and we're going to extend this plane out. But we don't really want to see this harsh edge here, but we also don't want to have to apply a particle system to a bigger plane, because that takes more particles and we'd have to dynamic paint on a bigger plane as well. So we're going to keep it as a small plane, but we're going to fade out the edges. And to do that, we're going to draw a custom texture using texture painting. But first, I'm just going to hide these particles from view. And we can also hide this sphere from view. And then I'm going to bring out the image editor and tabbing into edit mode, the UV image editor. I'm going to get rid of this image we had here before, and I'm going to click a new one. We can leave all those settings the same. So we've now got a new black image, and we're then going to change to texture painting. And if we click this little button down here, it means we can see the wireframe, which makes things a bit easier. And I'm going to press T, and we're going to basically paint white wherever we want the particles to appear. So I'm just going to uncheck all of these boxes so it doesn't restrict where we're drawing. And then I'm just going to draw with white wherever I want the particles to appear. And you can see that the image on the left gets updated because that's the image we're actually drawing onto, even though we're drawing in the 3D view. So we want to make sure we don't go too close to the edges, and we're just drawing the area where we are going to allow the particles to appear. And in the centre, we can have it far more white because that's where we want all the particles to appear. So you can see I've used a bigger radius brush with less strength at the edges, so it can be a fainter grey. And then in the centre, you can see it's solid white because that's where we want all the particles to appear. So now I'm just going to tidy this up in the UV image editor. So I'm going to change it to painting mode. I'm going to increase the radius, and we're just going to paint everywhere at the bottom white. And this is because we definitely want all the text to have particles on it. And it's only on the plane that we want to restrict where they are going to appear. So now what we can do is save this image. So I'm going to save it into the textures folder, and this is going to be called spread mask. And we only need RGB, we don't need an alpha channel, so we're going to save that. We'll change this back to view. We can collapse it down, go back to object mode. We'll turn our particles back on. And over in the texture panel, in the particles section, we're going to move this down, and above it we're going to add an image, and the image is going to be the image we just made. So spread mask, and this is going to be UV mapping, and again we're not affecting the time, we're affecting the length. And you can immediately see we've clipped around the edge. And if I go into top view, it's the image that we drew. And this means that we can extend this plane later on, and there won't be a harsh edge where the particles end. The next thing I'm going to do, and again I'm going to turn off these particles because they are slowing it down a bit, and I'm actually going to turn them off in the render as well. We're going to focus on the material for our text. So I'm going to get rid of this temporary one, which had the texture from before. I'm going to click new. I'm going to increase the specular, both values just to their maximums, and then we're going to start adding our textures. And the first one is going to be called colour, and this is going to be the image that we originally aligned our UVs to, which is this one. And this is going to be UV. Now the next texture I'm going to make, I'm actually going to make a few slots down. So I'm going to leave a bit of gap because I know more textures are going to go in here a bit later on. So I'm going to click new. This is going to be a blend. And then under colours we're going to click ramp, and this enables us to edit this blend. I'm going to delete one of the points, so it's basically just solid white instead of a gradient. And then clicking on the right hand side, you can't see it at the minute, but these two boxes are different. We're going to change this to be 0.6. And we're basically changing the alpha transparency of the blend. And then down here, I'm also going to set the emission to be 0.25. And this is actually going to be our ice, or what I've called ice. So I'm going to name it. It's good to name it because we're going to have quite a few textures. But obviously it's covering all of this texture at the minute, and we don't want that. So we're going to add a mask in up here. I'm going to click new, and this is going to be the fast spread mask. Now I'll explain the name a bit later on, but for the minute we're just going to load our image sequence in again. So we're going to open, select the first image, just like we did before. It's an image sequence, 240 frames. We want to auto refresh, so when we move along it updates the image. We're then going to use UV mapping, and we're not going to use colour because we don't want it to affect the colour. And what we're going to do is firstly turn on RGB to intensity, just so it takes into account that it's a black and white image, and then we're going to turn on stencil. And stencil says use this texture as a blending value on the next texture. So what's it going to do? It's going to affect this one, and it's going to effectively mask it out, and that's what you can see happening here. So if I turn that off, this ice texture is going over everything. Turn it on and it starts to mask it out. And so if I scroll through, you can see this start to decrease. And actually what I'm going to do, I'll give it a quick render. And so here you can see that ice texture is being masked out by a dynamic paint again. The next thing I'm going to do is add an ice bump texture. And this is using a texture I got off CG Textures. So we're going to change it to image. And the image we're going to use, it's called ice0009_1_m.jpg. And like I said, I got it off CG Textures. So if you want this one, you can go to that website and get it. And what I'm going to do is edit some of these color values. So I want the brightness to be 1.2. I'll just move it down so you can see. Contrast is going to be 1.1, and the saturation is going to be 0. So we're just going to use this as a bump, so we want it black and white. So this again is going to be UV. It's not going to affect the color, it's going to affect the normal, and we can leave that at 1. RGB to intensity, so it takes into account black values properly, and we're going to use the best quality of bump mapping. And you may be able to see slight bumpiness here, and to see it in the render we're going to have to add a lamp which can cast specular light. So I'm going to go into top view, place in the 3D cursor, shift A, lamp point, and this is going to be strength of 0.5, and then we'll just move it up a bit, and I'll then render that. And again, you might be able to see it, there is a slight bump. So we can see that the textures are going right to the edge of the plane. And obviously we've already set our particles to not go to the edge of the plane, and so the textures should do the same. And to do that, in this slot up here, I'm going to do new, image, and we're going to use this mask again, the one that we painted in texture paint mode. Just going to use UV mapping like all the others, and it's not going to use the colour, and it's going to be a stencil, so we need to turn on RGB to intensity as well. And if I just give that another render, we can see that the textures now are being masked out. And this texture I'm going to call spread mask, and then we've still got 2 more textures to make, and this is going to be slow white, and it's going to be a blend like the one before. So we want a ramp. I'm going to delete one of them, and this time we're going to set the alpha to be 0.85, so it's not quite as faint as the last one, which was 0.6, but we can't see it yet because it's being masked out by these masks up here. And so what we're going to do is add its own mask above it, and it's going to be that same image sequence that we've been using throughout. So dynamic spread, and again 240 in auto refresh, and UV mapping, and then it's not going to affect the colour, stencil RGB, and we can't actually see any change yet, but I am going to call this medium spread. And I called this one up here fast spread, but I didn't really explain why. And basically what we're going to do is shift some of the masks in time, and that means because they're image sequences, when we're on frame 124 it shows image 124, and so we're going to shift it slightly so the fast mask is pushed ahead in time a bit, and in fact we're going to push it 9 frames along. So basically, if we're on frame 120, it's going to display frame 129. So it's moving quicker than all the other ones. Or not moving quicker, but it's ahead of the other ones. The medium spread, I'm going to leave where it is. And you can now see, or you might be able to see, we've got a slight difference in the edge. And if I turn this off, you can see these layers, and it's creating this faint white. And if I turn on these 2 bottom ones, it's creating a more solid white, but it's slightly inset from the other one. And that's because the medium spread is still using the images from the current frame. Now that may be a bit confusing, but basically as the texture spreads, it basically gets bigger. And so we've pushed this one, this fast spread, ahead a bit, so it's a slightly bigger mask, which results in the texture being slightly outset. Now it may just be easier if I render this, and we can see what's going on. And I'm actually going to render this at full resolution so we can see exactly what's happening. And what we can see, it's quite faint, but we've got a line here that's going along, that's part of the more solid white, and then we've got a fainter white, which is out here. And that's because the fainter white is being masked by the image sequence a few frames ahead. So a few frames ahead in the image sequence means the dynamic paint has travelled a bit further, so the mask is slightly larger, so it displays this bit. But this image down here is being masked by the image sequence at the correct frame, so it hasn't travelled so far, and so the mask is a bit smaller. But what we're also going to do is this faster spread mask was pushed forward in time, and I'm actually going to push the particles backwards in time. So over on the particle texture tab, we've got this image sequence, and I'm putting an offset in of -5, and this means that the dynamic paint which is masking out the particles is slightly smaller than the dynamic paint masking out the textures. And so if I enable the particles again, and I'll render a bit smaller this time, we can see what's going on. So obviously we haven't done the material for the ice crystals yet, but what we can see is that they're in a smaller area than the textures. So we've got this dynamic paint image is masking the particles. We've then got this thin white outline around the edge, which is the dynamic paint images not offset. And then we've got this really faint image, which is being masked by dynamic paint images which are offset by 9 frames. And this creates a layering effect, because they're being masked at different times effectively. And so the next thing we're going to do is actually sort out this red material, so it's, well, not red. And it's very simple. We're going to change it to be basically white, but slightly off-white. And then we're going to turn on shadeless. And what shadeless does effectively says this material can't be shaded, and so it's going to always display completely flat. And so I'll render that to see the effect. And so now we can see the crystals are rendering properly. And the last thing we're going to do before we do a small bit of compositing is extend that plane out like I said we would. And again, I'm going to turn off particles in the viewport just because it does slow it down a bit. And then I'm going to create this new plane by just Shift A, add mesh plane. I'm going to make sure we've got vertex snapping on. We haven't actually got it turned on, we've got it selected, and when I press Control while moving, we will temporarily enable it. So I'm going to press G and X, and then holding Control to enable the snapping, I'm going to hover over this point so it snaps. In edit mode, we're then going to snap these edges up to the edges of this original plane. I'll then extrude this out, and extrude this out, and holding Control, we're going to snap, and we're basically just filling in the gaps around it. So then E, and then X, and then holding Control, we've basically done it. I'm then going to go into camera mode, and we want to just extend this edge out so it's beyond the line of view. I'm then going to separate these three faces, and we'll see why in a minute. So P and then selection, and then I'm just going to extrude this edge up, and this is going to create a curved wall at the back. And then I'm going to add a subsurf modifier, and we didn't want to add a subsurf to this part of the mesh because it would have rounded these corners off and we'd have had to sharpen them again, so it's easy just to separate them out. And then we're going to add it in a few loops with Control R just to sharpen up these edges. And then I'm just going to press space and then type shade smooth, turn the subdivisions up a bit, and now what we've got is a nice curved wall, and that basically is just a nice way of lighting things sometimes. We then need to give them a material, so I'm then going to tab into edit mode, go into top view, and then U project from view. We're going to do the same on this one, select everything, U project from view, and then bringing out a UV window. We're basically just going to move them into the top half, and that's because they're going to be using that same colour image as we used before. So it's going to be this one. So we're making sure they're both in the top half because we want them to be the same colour as this plane here. And then we're going to add a quick material. We're going to replicate the material on the other one, so it's just maximum specularity. And then we're just going to add in that image, which is this one. Change it to UV. So we want material 004. And so now it should all work. So the next thing to do is set it back to full. Make sure we're rendering our particles, which we are. Do a full render, and then we'll do a bit of compositing. And actually, one thing we are going to do is set the samples up to 10 on the world settings for the gather panel. Set it up to 10, and that just removes a bit of the grain. And the other thing we're going to do before we render is under layers, we're just going to make sure that we've got normal ticked, because we're going to use the normal pass in the compositing. One other problem I spotted was that we weren't quite fitting in our plane properly, so I'm just going to press GY just so we're covering all areas of the image with that back plane, and then we should be good to render. So that's finished rendering, and we can now see some of those details up close, such as the bump map working. But one problem we are getting is that we're getting these little black dots, and I don't know quite what they're caused by, but it's something to do with the particles being really small at the edges, and that's something we're going to try and get rid of in the compositor, which we're going to do now. So over to the node editor, compositing nodes, want to use nodes, use a backdrop, and then Shift A output viewer. And the first thing we're going to do is to try and deal with those black dots, and I just zoomed in with Alt V. We're going to Shift A, filter bilateral blur, and then Shift A, color mix. I'm going to change the mix node to add, and instead of linking in the image, we're going to put the Z pass into the bottom and the normal pass into the top. We're going to move our bilateral blur in, and instead of image, we're going to use the Z and normal pass combined as a determinator, and then we're going to plug in our original image into the top. You can see it's taking a bit of time to compute things, because the bilateral blur is quite expensive in terms of compositing time, but what you can see is that it's removed out all our little dots. I'm going to change a few settings though. I'm going to change the mix factor to be 0.2. I'm going to change this color sigma value to be 0.1, and then the space sigma below it to be 10. I can't fully explain what this does. All I really know is that it's using the Z pass and the normal pass to try and work out where edges are in the image, and it's blurring in between those parts. And so you'll really have to play with these values to find something that works for you. Now I'm zooming out with V again, and what I'm actually going to do is mute these by pressing M, and that's just so we can do the rest of the compositing without waiting for them to calculate each time. So the next thing I'm going to do is add in a matte and then an ellipse mask, because we're going to add a vignette. So I'm going to shift A, color mix, we're going to set this to multiply, and we're going to plug in our mask. Obviously that's not quite what we want yet, so I'm going to set the width to 1 and the height to be 0.5, and then I'm going to shift A, filter blur, I'm going to set it to relative, so it uses a percent rather than specific pixels, and I'm going to use a big blur of 25 and 25. I'm then also going to set this to be 0.8, so we can effectively turn down the effect of the vignette by decreasing this number. And the final thing we're going to do is color, and then color balance, and then we're going to connect that to our composite. And this is something I don't really know what each of these do, but I just play around with them, and I'm going to shift this image into a bit of blue so it seems a bit colder. And so you can see I really just played around with them, moved them a bit into blue, and it's turned the image nice and cold. And so what we've got here is the final effect. And there's just one thing I want to mention, and that is we set our dynamic paint images to run up to frame 240, but we also have an offset value for one of our textures, and that means on the fast spread, this number in brackets here is the frame it will try to play from our image sequence. But because we have an offset of 9, what this actually means is that when we get to frame 231, this is the last frame that we can have as our animation. And that's because on frame 231, this texture will offset to the last frame in the sequence, which is 240. If we go beyond this, then there are no more images in the sequence, and it will simply go blank and won't render. So with the settings we had, the last frame you can render is 231. If you wanted it longer, then you would simply render more dynamic paint images, and however many images you baked, take away 9, and that's the last frame you can play. But that obviously depends on how many frames you offset that by. So I hope you learnt something from this tutorial. All the textures we did can actually be done far more easily in Cycles, so there won't be any problem if you do want to do this in Cycles instead. I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. If you think there's something I can do better, please say so in the comments, or if you have any other ideas for effects that you think I should do, please also say that. I hope to see you in the next tutorial. Goodbye.